Jason's there. He's chairing this. No. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are waiting on Councilmember Jason Dozier, he's caught in a different meeting right now, but I'm going to go ahead and convene the work session, and he'll join us and other council members as they're available. My name is Alex Wan. I am chair of the Finance Executive Committee. This is a joint work session between our committee as well as Councilmember Dozier's Community Development and Human Services. We're joined by my colleagues to my right, Councilmember Matt Westmoreland, and to my left, Council President Doug Shipman. I do anticipate we'll have other council members joining us along the route here. With that, just so that everybody knows kind of the game plan, run of show for today, we are going to hear from Invest Atlanta first with some updates on the tax allocation districts, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions from my colleagues, and then we will entertain public comment at the end after that. If you would like to speak, please make sure that you sign up on the computer monitor over there, as well as the sign-in sheets. And then we're also joined by Councilmember Mary Norwood. The genesis of there's Councilmember Jason Dozier. The genesis of this work session stems from a number of things. Number one, obviously, Community Development and Human Services Committee has purview over the TADs and gets regular updates from Invest Atlanta. But given the importance of this redevelopment tool, we thought it was worth it for all of us to take a deeper dive, get an update, and just refresh everybody's minds on TADs, the strategies, as well as the ones that we have. And then the second piece of it is kind of now that a number of the TADs have been in place for a long time, at some point the tool should be deemed complete, and so this gives us an opportunity to have that dialogue, understand where all the TADs are, what future plans there might be for the ones that still have a lot of work to do, and then let us have a policy conversation around anything appropriate from that point. Councilmember Dozier, I don't know if you want to add anything before we jump into their presentation.
Just to say thank you, Councilmember Wan, and thank you all for joining us today. I know I'm in a room with a lot of very busy people, so I know you're taking time out of that day to join us, but just really appreciate that, and really appreciate my colleagues for taking interest in this subject. I'm thankful for the Invest Atlanta team who serve on the Invest Atlanta board, and so I get a lot of the behind-the-scenes look at how our tax allocation districts work, but I recognize that many of my colleagues don't always get that same kind of behind-the-curtain peek at how these systems work, and so I'm just glad we're all in this room together, and just with that being said, Dr. Clementich, I believe you're the first or next item on our agenda. If you would like to go ahead with your presentation, and we can go from there.
We're on. Okay. Good morning. Yes, my name is Dr. Eloisa Clementich. I'm the proud president at Invest Atlanta. So thank you so much for having us. And more importantly, I just want to say thank you for your confidence in Invest Atlanta to be able to administer these TADs on behalf of the city. We are very proud to be able to do that. The way today is going to work is we broke it off into 3 basic sections. The first section is we're going to go over a very high level of governance of what gives us what is a tax allocation district and where do we receive those powers from. And I will ask Rosalind Rubens-Noor, our general counsel, to preside over that section. Then at Invest Atlanta, Roz is at Invest Atlanta. Then we will go to our completion report, exactly what council member asked for, and this will look at each TAD. We have been asked by the city council to do a completion report every 3 years. So this is now the presentation of the second completion report, and it will be done by our phenomenal advisors, H&R advisors. Candace Damon will go ahead and preside and provide you that update. And then we're going to end, the third section will be on our financials. We look at each TAD specifically, how much is available, what has been used, and what's in the pipeline, so you see what the expectation is on each of those TADs. Since they're kind of in buckets, I'd like to humbly suggest that maybe we could take questions after each section, so you don't have to remember all your questions throughout. So after someone's done, then we'll take questions on that section, and then we'll move on to the others if that works. Okay, with that, then I'll go ahead and get started and call up Rosalind Rubens-Noor. Roz.
Good morning, council members. I have the opportunity to talk to you a little about TAD, what we would call TAD 101. I know that council members Westmoreland and Dozier hear this at Invest Atlanta board meetings, but if you would just go with me, I'll try to make it interesting but short. How about that? Well, I'm supposed to advance. I'm supposed to do this at the same time. Okay.
And I do want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councilmember Antonio Lewis.
I would like to say that I have had the honor in working on all 10 of the city's TADs, initially at the time of their creation, in getting financing for developers all over the city of Atlanta, and now in my role as general counsel in the administration of the TADs. Georgia is weird, and we call tax allocation districts TADs. Everywhere else in the country, it is called tax increment financing. It's a concept that was originally developed in California in 1952. It's used in all 50 states and in the District of Columbia. Tax increment financing is usually a tool that's worked in conjunction with tax increment financing and is a way of redeveloping or developing underutilized, underserved, undercapitalized areas of the community. As you know, places that are hot don't need incentives. This is a tool for community development and redevelopment. And the increment is used, and I'll show you a little picture in a second of the increment, but that tax increment is what is used to finance new developments. It can be used to abate blight, to abate environmental, like for example, Atlantic Station was initially the tool to abate an environmental brownfield. You can remove dilapidated, unsightly facilities. It can remediate areas that have improper infrastructure, whether that's water and sewer or even an appropriate street grid. And it's a method of self-financing that does not require the city to, for example, issue general obligation bonds. In the state of Georgia, Atlanta, as in with everything else, Atlanta has led in the use of this tool. In 1985, the Georgia General Assembly initially gave cities and counties the power to use tax increment financing. The law is called the Redevelopment Powers Law, and I like to say that's my favorite Georgia law because it really enables the city to target resources and financing where it is needed the most. So the state law authorizes creating the tax allocation districts. They set up the funding mechanism and allow for issuing bonds. And so you'll see today that a lot of our TADs, some are older. The West Side TAD was the first TAD that was ever created. And then what we call the 4 corridor TADs were the last 4 right after the Beltline were created. But all the bonds, and we have not been applying the economic tool. You'll see on lots of them that, bonds weren't issued a week after the TADs were created, and you ask yourself, well, why was everybody just sitting around? No. So in about 2005, after the Beltline and Perry Bolton were created, a citizen activist, John Woodham, sued the city of Atlanta, and that involved a lot of litigation by a lot of lawyers that did not get resolved until 2008. And in 2008, the Georgia Supreme Court said, oh, we don't think you got the school board permissions right. And so that meant in 2008, there had to be a constitutional amendment that had to go through the General Assembly, get on the ballot, get approved by the voters, and then at the next session, the redevelopment powers law got reenacted. So you'll see, in particular, for Perry Bolton and Beltline, we were unable to initially issue any bonds and get those TADs, kind of the financing on the road. Something that comes up when we talk to City Council often is the but-for test, and sometimes it comes up at our board meeting too, and I just wanted to provide you this reference, and you can hopefully just hang on to this this reference, and if you have any questions. But the but-for test says that that redevelopment has not existed in a particular area for any number of reasons, and we talked about it could be blight, slum, it could be environmental reasons, but for the use of this tool, the area is not likely to redevelop. And so that but-for test is a finding that the City Council makes, but at the time that the TAD is created. And so kind of once you make that legislative finding, then the but-for test doesn't apply anymore, because I know we have a lot of slides, but if you look at, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading all of these, but this is the list under Georgia law of the conditions that have to exist for an area to qualify as a tax allocation district. And they're all a list of things that are obstacles to development and redevelopment. So if you hang on to those, you will have those. Something that often comes up in our discussions and at Invest Atlanta board meeting, and when Invest Atlanta is taking in applications for TAD funding. But TAD funding can only be used for capital costs related to redevelopment. So, for example, acquisition of property, construction of buildings, rehab of historic buildings, providing some capital financing. For example, when the Arthur and Blank Foundation created West Side Works, we could not use TAD financing to pay for the instructors and the curriculum. What the TAD contributed to that was to the redevelopment, rehab of the building, so that there would be a location for West Side Works. So all of these kind of capital costs, construction and demolition, acquisition, clearing, grading, and then what you think of as the soft costs that are related to redevelopment. So like financing, professional services, real estate costs, and pilot payments or payments in lieu of taxes to sister jurisdictions. So that is one of the provisions that the Georgia General Assembly included in the law. This slide is a picture of, or a graphic representation of how TADs work. So at the beginning on the left-hand side of the graph, you have the beginning assessed value. Let's say the property is assessed at $100. So if you'll see that during the life of the TAD, that $100 continues to be paid to the taxing jurisdictions. But if you look at the increasing triangle in the dark blue, that represents the increment. So over time, and what creates the increment is construction that occurs in the TAD that gets assessed by the Fulton County Board of Assessors and then receives a tax bill from the Fulton County Tax Commissioner, and those taxes are paid. So that increasing triangle there is what gets paid into the special fund and is eligible to be used for redevelopment costs. When the TAD is completed, and that is that the redevelopment objectives of the redevelopment plan have been substantially met and there are no redevelopment costs to be paid, then the city council passes legislation declaring those two things. There are no outstanding redevelopment costs and the goals of the plan have been substantially completed. Then the the full amount of the tax payment is returned in full to the taxing jurisdictions. Okay, I'm clicking this. If you give me, I just want to flip over to, it's, I think, 14 in your package. And this little diagram tells you where the tax allocation districts are. When Nino gets to his section of the financial aspects of the TAD, you'll see that not all of the TADs have participation by all three taxing jurisdictions. So, for example, the Princeton Lakes Tad that is all the way down in the southwest section, which, by the way, adjoins East Point's Camp Creek Marketplace, and they were developed so seamlessly that you really can't tell where one starts and the other one ends. So the Princeton Lakes TAD has no APS contribution, and so as a result, that is probably but the redevelopment objectives have probably been substantially completed, which is what your consultant will probably find today. And if the outstanding loan were paid off, then the city council would enact legislation and that TAD could then be terminated. The four commercial TADs, so that is Hallowell, MLK, the stadium area, which used to refer to Turner Field Stadium, the Camilton Road TAD, and the Metropolitan Parkway TAD. They are significantly smaller than some of the larger TADs like East Side and West Side. And did you have a question, council member? No? Okay.
We'll get through your portion and we'll open it to
okay. So those TADs are substantially smaller. They did not have any APS contribution until this tax year. So in an agreement that was worked out with APS, they are now starting to contribute to those four small corridor TADs. And each one, of course, probably the most significant being the Beltline, has their own story to tell. When they were all created, at the time of their creation, the City Council included in the legislation that Invest Atlanta was to act as the redevelopment agent. And so when we come to you, when matters come before the Invest Atlanta Board, it is in our capacity as your redevelopment agent. One of the things that makes Beltline unique is that Invest Atlanta then created the nonprofit Atlanta Beltline, Inc. to actually implement the Beltline redevelopment plan. And so my intent was to try to provide you with some TAD information in a concise fashion. Could I answer any questions or any other things about TADs?
And before I turn it over to colleagues, I do want to acknowledge that we have been joined by Councilmember Byron Amos, Councilmember Marcia Collier Overstreet, and so we'll go ahead and go into questions. Councilmember Lewis, do you still have a question? I'll give you the first crack, and then Councilmember Juan.
My question was around why is the East Side TAD, you said, larger than a TAD says the Metropolitan or a Princeton Lake TAD?
Well, the short answer is that is sort of how the city created them. East Side and West Side were sort of created to encompass the matching areas of downtown. One thing I did not mention is that the Redevelopment Powers Law has a provision that says no more than 10% of the tax digest. In order to create a new TAD, no more than 10% of the city's tax digest can be within TADs. At the time that the Beltline was created in 2005, there was very little room to get to that 10% of the digest. However, council members that represented those areas, I think, still wanted those important commercial strips to be included, and so I think that's the reason for their size. Those four were created last.
Councilman Juan.
Thank you, Councilmember Dozier. I wanted to go back to the Georgia statute that allows us to create TADs in the but-for test. Those qualifications, are they quantifiable or are they subjective?
I guess that they're factual in that the city council has to make factual findings, but the city council makes those findings based on a redevelopment plan. So the law requires that a redevelopment plan be created for the area. Before the redevelopment plan can be adopted, there had to be 2 public hearings that were held in the evenings. And so the bases for creating the TADs would be in the redevelopment plan, and then the city council would have the legislative discretion to make the finding that they exist, but it would be based on what was in the plan.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to get at, is there some sort of rubric that we can use to establish the but-for requirement compliance on the state side that then can also be applied to the specific projects that then come up for review? Or is it all, again, relatively subjective?
Well, an example would be one of the things when in Invest Atlanta, when staff takes in an application, you would look and see, was the intent to redevelop Auburn Avenue or Edgewood Avenue, and so and is that project located there? So, it's wouldn't say it's like a numeric scoring, but yes, it has to appear in fulfillment of the redevelopment plan. Is
okay.
What I would say.
I'm going to pivot a little bit and then dive into what I really wanted to get at, and that is the actual, the slide number 9, what kinds of, no, that's not right. Yeah, number 9, what kinds of expenses are TAD eligible? So if I understand correctly, there is also a but-for kind of application in terms of evaluation of potential projects to be funded through TAD dollars. Is that correct?
So the but-for test that you find in here isn't applied. What is applied, and this would be, staff and, like I said, receiving funding applications is, the project has to need the financing. So there has to be a financing gap that without this tool, this project that meets the redevelopment plan wouldn't be able to get done. So if you could kind of call it the but-for test, but it's not this but-for test.
I gotcha. Okay, so can you talk me through the process a little bit then between a project comes to Invest Atlanta, there's an application that says, hey, I need $10, being extreme there. Who reviews those and then makes the recommendation to fund or not? I'm assuming there's still a TAD committee on your board.
Yes.
And then the approval process, I believe, is done by the full Invest Atlanta board.
Yes.
Right. That includes representatives from the other participating municipalities, whether or not they are actually sponsoring that particular TAD, correct?
That is correct. So we have, Invest Atlanta has 4 committees, one of which is the Tax Allocation District Policy Committee, members, our board member who is from APS and the board member from the Fulton County BOC are always on TAD committee. Our committees then make recommendations to the full board. So, so an application comes in. We have professional staff with redevelopment experience, finance experience. We have planners who review the application. The criteria that are applied are already published on our website, so a developer would know. Then if there is a favorable staff recommendation, we have something called the Internal Loan and Investment Committee. So that's an internal committee made of other experts at Invest Atlanta who then sift through and kind of vet the underwriting for the project. I don't sit on ILIC. Nino, our CFO, does. He might be able to give you a little more details. So so staff, then ILIC, and then it would go to, if all those are favorable, then they would go to our committee. And so that's just the appointed board members. It would go to committee with a favorable recommendation by staff, presented to the committee, and then presented to the full board.
Okay. And then through all of those pieces, you mentioned that there needs to be a financing gap in order to make the project work. I'm hoping, and I'm going to pause here because I want to get into it when we talk about whether TADs are substantively complete or not. Just because a project doesn't have that has a financing gap, to me, shouldn't necessarily qualify them for TAD funding. I do believe that there should additionally be some sort of but-for requirement. Just because I can't find $10, or I haven't worked real hard to find that $10 in my financing package, to me doesn't necessarily mean I should get TAD funding.
And I would not, and I'm sorry if it seemed like that was the criteria. No, there's a set of criteria. Is the project even feasible? Unfortunately, we don't have any program people here with us today, but there's a number of criteria besides there being a funding gap that has to be met. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
No, I think we all understood that, but I just wanted to just kind of highlight that point because, again, when we start talking about the TADs that may or may not be substantively complete, I do think that's going to be an important factor. Obviously, Invest Atlanta has gotten a lot of public eyes on it in terms of projects that have been funded, and just some question from the public as to whether or not the but-for requirement actually was met. I mean, there's other financing tools, not just the TAD piece, but I do think it's going to be an important part of our conversation today.
And part of what the application has to bring is the viability of the other portions of their capital.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Chair Dozier.
Councilman Wine. Councilman Westmoreland.
Thank you, Chair Dozier, and thank you all for a super comprehensive packet. You mentioned that the Atlanta Public Schools is joining the 4-quarter TADs effective this fiscal year, so
yes.
Starting last month. Is APS out of the East Side TAD? I noticed that they also effective July.
No, theirs was effective, I believe, in fiscal year 20. So their portion, APS's portion of the increment that comes from the East Side TAD is rebated back to them.
Okay. And then I have to leave, so I'm going to ask one question that's kind of legally related from the appendix. Fulton County is set to leave the West Side TAD in 2023?
No, Fulton County, all 3 taxing jurisdictions are extended to 2037.
Okay. And then Fulton and Atlanta Public Schools are slated to leave Perry Bolton in 2027. But our debt, the bonds aren't set to be paid off until 2041. It's on page 47.
I I did not. You can't close a TAD until all the redevelopment costs are paid. So if it's sort of like, the same issue that exists with Atlantic Station, that it can't be closed until all the debt is paid off. Now, whether in Perry Bolton there'll be some excess increment that could be used to retire the debt early, I don't know.
Okay. If I understand the TAD can't be closed, if they're set to leave in 2027, then the city of Atlanta would be, they can't leave.
They can't
is what
leave.
you're saying, even if they want to. Excellent.
Even if they want to.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Real quick, just want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councilmember Liliana Bakhtiari. Up next, we'll have a question from Councilmember Byron Amos, and then we'll go to Council President Doug Shipman.
Thank you very much. And Matt actually started on it. It's really chicken come home to roost or looking in the mirror. I was actually on the Board of Education when we made these significant changes, and it may, I don't know if it's already in here, in which he pointed it out, I think you did, for a little bit of education piece on the impact of APS not funding at the level that they used to, or Fulton County, and then in what TADs, because I know we went through a lot centered around the Beltline TADs at that point, but if the information is already in here, just point it to us, because like you say, you got a lot of slides and a lot of information to go over.
Sure. So in the Nino is going to cover it, but if you take a look at those slides in the back that are TAD specific, they'll each tell you whether it's Atlanta, Fulton, and APS. And I believe Nino's going to cover it also.
Council President Shipman and Councilmember Overstreet.
Thanks. I would follow up on page 9, the uses. There are a lot of projects that have been funded over time that will have some sort of upkeep or maintenance, and then also in the back there's a call for open spaces and other types of things as potential. Could you just talk about whether or not maintenance falls into any of the approved uses, improvements, renovation? Where's the line between maintaining something and renovating it or improving it?
Okay, well, that is really an IRS tax question, but let me try to...
So what have we done in the past? Where have we drawn the line?
Well, generally, let's use city projects, because there are times when the city comes and says they need an allocation for a sewer project, or even we're currently acquiring property for the East Side Greenway. So Invest Atlanta would do the acquisition. We're also we clean and grade it and then convey it to the city. After that time, then TAD funds are no longer used for the maintenance and upkeep. I think if it's, and Nino may know the answer better than I do, but I think if it's ordinary maintenance and upkeep, that's considered operations as opposed to renovation, rehabilitation. But there's an answer to that, but I believe it's in the IRS tax code.
And the third bullet point of professional services doesn't, that's professional services is defined as like administrative professional services as opposed to something?
No, it could be, the statute authorizes administrative costs separately, and then professional services, for example, if you need environmental phase 1 or phase 2 studies, you need attorneys to draft documents, you need engineers to figure out whether a historic building is still, can stand up. So those kind of professional services, because they are directly related to the TAD.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Council President. Councilmember Overstreet.
Thank thank you again for this packet, because I like to refer back every year. I know we probably have had several of these work sessions, but it's never enough, to be honest. So thank you very much. I just want to dive in a little deeper about the Campbellton Road TAD.
Sure.
I know that because of the agreement with the Gulch or Centennial Yards, that what you were speaking about, everything is going to change this year,
Yes.
2022.
Yes.
So is there a specific date that starts? Like when does
So
it
I
start?
believe it is for the tax year 2021. Is that correct?
If he doesn't mind coming up,
Yeah.
and
Sure.
we can see who's saying what.
There, so the agreement, the
And if you
payments...
could identify yourself as well. for the
Excuse me, so
public.
I'm Nino Chiappetta, I'm the CFO at Invest Atlanta. So the payments were made in July of '22. The payments that were made in July of '22 were retroactive for the last 2 years, but effective in July of '22, all taxes collected from now on, not all taxes, there's a cap of $2 million between the 4 corridor TADs, will go to the corridor TADs.
Okay. And so that is roughly what is that? How much is that per each?
So you specifically want to know about the Campbellton Road TAD?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's no longer going to be called a pay-as-you-go TAD. It's going to be called what? Regular TAD, starting with the payments in July 2022. Understood. Just now, is that in the packet? I've not had a chance to go through this packet at all.
So what we did is the first part, Roz is going to go over just the general legal structure of the TAD. Then we have the completion report, and then Nino's going to deep dive in all the financials. So we just thought we would break it down. So if you are ready, we can move to the next section, and then we'll break it down on the financials. Is that okay?
Yes, and
Just trying to do it
again, thank you for this packet. This type of information is always good for us to have as a reference. So yes, I'm ready for the next.
Okay, and just want to clarify, Carl, any other questions before we move to the next sessions? All right, no worries.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so again, every 3 years, we're asked to do a completion report. What's the status of the TAD? How complete are we? This is the second one HRNA's done for us, and Candace is as part of that HRNA team, is going to present that for us. Candace.
Good morning, council members.
Morning.
I think I'm going to apologize to the audience because I think all of us have come with something that works better as a handout than as slides. There's also...
And if you could introduce yourself as well.
I'm sorry. I'm Candace Damon. I'm the chair of HR&A Advisors, and it's very nice to be back here with some familiar faces. And there's a certain amount of overlap between what I think all three of us are presenting, so I propose to move fairly quickly. And if you want me to go back and review some things, that would be fine. So this slide really goes to the presentation that you just heard and reviews how we got where we are. I think what's critical here that some of you have begun to highlight is a lot depends upon the participation of all the taxing entities, and particularly in historically underserved neighborhoods where the real estate tax base and the potential for increment growth is more constrained, that if particular taxing entities don't sign up, it makes it much harder to move forward, which we're going to see, I think, in our analysis of where we are in completion and in Nino's analysis of the finances. So, second, as you heard, every single one of these tax allocation districts has a redevelopment plan that looked at the specific conditions in the district when the district was created, put together a plan and said this is what we're trying to solve with this source of funding. The program as a whole, though, has certain goals associated with it, and I think if you scan these goals, they look like the goals that you would expect for reinvestment in most of America's large cities 30 years ago. And I don't mean to say that these are the wrong goals today. I think there's lots of reasons to think these are the right goals. But I think if you were redesigning the program today, there might be more attention to what's going on in neighborhoods, a stronger bet on the central business districts, and more attention to equity. This is the program that was designed 30 years ago, and I think, as we'll see in a few slides, what Invest Atlanta has done really cleverly and creatively over the intervening years is to think about how it could respond to changing conditions in the city. Again, those are the districts. So, in aggregate, we would argue that the program has been wildly successful. In aggregate, you're looking at a 12-to-1 return on investment ratio, which is frankly extraordinary. So most of these kinds of public investments around the country, when they're successful, we're looking at 5 or 6-to-1, 12-to-1, and you should be proud of yourselves. Something, depending on how you count, 35 to 45% of that return has been achieved in the last 5 years, clearly a function of the growing strength of the city and the ability of the TAD program to be a meaningful component of it. So the law provides you with a very great deal of flexibility and practically no guidance about when tax and allocation districts ought to be shut down. As you've heard, the only thing that it distinctly says is that all the redevelopment costs have to be paid. So what we have been privileged to do for the 10 years that we've been working with you is to work collaboratively with you and with Invest Atlanta to think through a set of metrics for determining when a tax allocation district should be wound down, and the priority should be paying off the redevelopment costs rather than continuing to invest. In some ways, I think our major value add was in 2013 when we went through all the redevelopment plans and developed a set of metrics by which you could measure whether the goals that had been established for each district had actually been achieved. And in the appendix to this presentation, where we walk through all of the districts and we evaluate each of the goals and assign metrics and say, is it done? Is it, are we getting there? Are we not getting there? That's the meat of the analysis that we've done over these years. And so that definition of how would one know whether what one was done or not really proceeded from an examination of goal by goal, district by district, what are metrics that you could assign to understand whether you were achieving that goal, because none of that was done when the districts were set up. So for instance, if you say you're trying to increase the housing supply, then how many units of housing were created? If you say you're trying to create a safer neighborhood, what do crime stats look like before and after? And then that district by district examination allows us to recommend, first to Invest Atlanta and then to you, that districts be labeled either not complete, because the goals have fundamentally not been achieved yet, partially complete, where progress is being made, but more work remains to be done, or substantially complete, which functionally means done, except we have to pay down the redevelopment costs. And so in 2013, what City Council agreed was that to the extent that it agreed with that assessment, that a district was substantially complete, that no more new investments would be made and the districts would be wound down. So as of the last assessment, we had 3 districts in the partially complete column and 2 in the substantially complete column. And since that assessment, really since 2013, I think you've seen a variety of very significant changes in the city that impact our assessment of what's done and what's not done. I think fundamentally today, there is no city in this country, possible exception of New York City, that when it assesses its competitors doesn't list Atlanta. That was definitely not the case 10 years ago. It's an extraordinary transformation of the city, and the TAD program has clearly been part of that. The evidence of your competitiveness in the country is seen in the strong multifamily growth, declining unemployment, declining office and retail vacancy, improved strength of downtown, which for years has lagged the other CBDs, which doesn't mean there aren't challenges. Development has been concentrated in a few areas of the city, and the suburbs continue to be extremely competitive for commercial growth. In that time period, what the TAD program has invested in is providing gap funding for large-scale development projects, the kinds of projects Councilman Juan was asking about a moment ago, but then also doing some less conventional for Atlanta, interesting kinds of incremental investments in revitalization of the existing building stock, particularly important in downtown, supporting community organizations, and using its funds to leverage investment in infrastructure. Much of that, especially those last three categories, was really the creative response of Invest Atlanta to the last Great Recession, where the Invest Atlanta looked at itself and said, I have a tool that's fundamentally about investing in real estate, and I have no real estate market. So how can we use the city's signature economic development tool, where there is no real estate investment occurring, where it's designed to be a real estate incentive? And what emerged from that self-examination in 2013 and the real growth and change in the program is increasing focus on investing in infrastructure and understanding that as part of a partnership with other funding agencies, that infrastructure can really juice neighborhoods in a way that investment in one-off development projects may not be. Also, Invest Atlanta has invested in small neighborhood streetscaping, open space, has begun to land bank in a city where land costs are increasingly expensive. That's clearly going to be critically important, including for an affordability agenda, and has been, as I said a moment ago, subsidizing commercial building retrofits to accommodate climate change and operating costs. Again, doesn't mean there aren't challenges, principally from suburban competition. The commercial TADs, which, as you've heard, partly as a function of their history, but also of the fact that the APS has not participated until very recently, have struggled. And then you have three districts, the east side most important, where I think there's a real interest, I would suspect, on your part and on Invest Atlanta to think through how cash on hand can most effectively be utilized. Current construction costs, the amount of money that's in Perry Bolton and West Side may be less significant, but certainly there's a lot of money in the East Side TAD, which remains to be spent primarily as a function of the way the initial indenture was drafted. Some kind of misadventure in legal representation resulted in an inability to spend money on projects until very, very recently. So now you have a cash buildup and a chance to really think about how to most effectively invest in that critically important TAD. So where does that leave us? We think we move two more TADs into the partially complete column, and thinking through how we move all five of those into the column, that column into the substantially complete column, becomes a lot of the work, I think, of this joint committee and of Invest Atlanta. So what does that mean for each of them? Again, this is detailed in the appendix to the packet, but in the substantially complete TADs, this slide hasn't really changed in 4 years, whenever we were last year. Hasn't really changed in 4 years. What's happened is that we've begun to see pay down, that Invest Atlanta has acted on the direction from this committee and the council and begun to wind down these TADs. In the partially complete TADs, I think there are a set of specific investments that are suggested that relate to the initial goals set for the redevelopment plan and Invest Atlanta and our assessment of how the progress that's being made goal by goal in these districts. On the east side, I think, and in the interest of full disclosure, we are in fact working in Sweet Auburn right now, but I think the focus on Sweet Auburn and ensuring that Sweet Auburn remains an authentic and affordable community is presumably a major focus of East Side TAD investment. I think what you're seeing in the stadium area is a really interesting example of what partnering with another large organization might look like. So in fact, a lot of the growth and progress in the stadium area is not a function of TAD investment, but there's an opportunity now to think through how TAD can add to the investment that's already occurring there to leverage that strength. And in the Beltline, clearly the job is to finish the investment and think through how it's going to be maintained, to Councilman Shipman's question. And then finally, there is the question of the small commercial TADs, which are clearly not complete, and there the imperative is on welcoming the APS money and thinking through what other kinds of partners can be brought to the table to leverage the potential of those districts.
Thank you so much. Any questions on this section from colleagues? Councilman Lewis.
I'm just thinking of timelines. Do you know when the stadium area TAD was created in comparison to the Metropolitan Parkway and Increment Road?
So according to this slide on the next page, the stadium area TAD and the Metropolitan Parkway TAD, and I'm sorry, what was the last one that you asked about?
Hamilton.
All created in 2006.
So how is it that, my next question is, how is it that this one was able to move so much faster than the other two? Is it just because of Georgia State only?
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Councilman Juan and Councilman Ramus.
All right, so in terms of the slide that you have that showed kind of the movement from 17 to 20, this is good to see, and I appreciate it. It aligns with kind of my expectation of where we would be at this point. Your evaluation methodology that creates this, I'm assuming there's probably some sort of scorecard that you do, and it's based on activity and all that. So then, if we were to take a deeper dive into the partially complete, would we see kind of them scattered along a scale that some are more close to not complete, but there are others that are actually closer to substantially complete?
Yes, and if you wanted to do that, yes, that's all available. Okay. And yes, there's absolutely a conversation about, why did you decide this crime rate rather than that crime rate that could be had?
Okay. All right, so there is kind of this matrix of valuation criteria. Yeah, I do think that would be helpful to have after this session. Yeah, I think because, as we know, everyone in that category is not really along the same point at the same point in that continuum. So, thank you.
Councilman Juan. Councilman Ramus.
Yes, thank you. Been at this for a while, so if I say some things that are not still true, please correct me, because I remember these conversations with the Atlanta Development Authority years ago. Westside TAD, the oldest TAD, listed as partially complete, but arguably one of the ones that need to stay open. Still a lot of challenges. When it was first created, there was the neighborhood side and the downtown side. That still exists, and a certain percentage of downtown increments actually would go into the neighborhood side. Okay, so I'm glad to know that still operates. Then the expansion. I see you listed expansion in 98. Then we add the Gulch a couple of years ago to the West Side TAD, or I see movement.
Right. So the Gulch.
This is where having a New Yorker up here is not.
But I'm a New Yorker too. So the Gulch was always a part of the West Side TAD, both the inclusion, it's always been within the perimeter. In addition to that, in the redevelopment plan that was written, it noted that the Gulch needed to be redeveloped, that it had laid fallow since the 1940s or 50s. So it wasn't expanded for purposes of the project. We administratively segregated those parcels. So what does that mean? That the Gulch only gets the benefit of the increment from the parcels that are in that Gulch area. They don't, if there's an increase in the rest of the downtown West Side TAD or in the neighborhoods, those Gulch parcels don't get any benefit from that. That money is not available to be used by them.
Okay, but thank you for the clarification, because in my past life, we got the information as an expansion, so thank you. And this is a question you probably can answer at a later date, but what have we learned? And what I mean by that is the West Side TAD is the oldest TAD on the book, but yet we have opened up new TADs that we have opened and closed. Where's the progress? What are we doing different? I would like to see a day at the West Side TAD that we have TAD ourselves out of business, but the need is still there for the West Side TAD, but I see other TADs have opened and closed. What have we learned, and what can we do different to bring about that same type of energy and synergy on the West Side to one day close down the West Side TAD? And that may be a future question, so.
No, again, Eloisa Clemente, Invest Atlanta. I'd say one of the things that we've learned at Invest Atlanta was we were, at least when I first arrived, there was concerted effort in investing in a certain type of product or doing a certain type of initiative. What we've done now is taken, I think Candace alluded to it, is a holistic view of the community. I vividly remember being in a community meeting and someone saying, Eloisa, we don't live in compartmentalized lives, don't give us compartmentalized solutions. And that really hit home. And so we've created this matrix of looking at how do we support education initiatives, how do we support clean and safe, how do you support housing, how do you support retail, how do you support all the components that a community needs, and it's with that strategy that we've come in with the TADs, and you've seen us invest in a wider array. So facade improvement, that's important. So safety and security, cameras are important. People need to feel safe walking to the local store. The local store looks nice with the facade. I need to find a place to live. How do we leverage all this together? I need a place for daycare. I need a place to take my kids. I need a place to play. And so you see our strategies across the spectrum to really try to bring to, and I hadn't heard that, and I love it, is out-tad us. What'd you say? Outgrow the TAD. I love that. But that was our strategy going forward, is how do we look at a community holistically and try to ensure that we're able to, across the spectrum, provide the influence and provide holistic solutions for neighborhoods.
And thank you. And because we all play a role in this, and I must take my part. I did not know there was a shift, but just being a resident and being out there, I have seen the shift of the different type of projects and things that you have funded. So thank you for that. And I'm glad to see it's a different type of day that we're living inside the TAD space. So thank you.
Any other questions from colleagues? I just have, okay, Council President. Okay. So on the tug on a string that Councilmember Lewis had made reference to, and thinking about the state and neighborhood TAD, where a lot of that growth has been with Georgia State, I imagine that when private developers are building and leveraging TAD funding or adding to TADs by their own development, that increases the potential for other developments to leverage that increment for future developments. But when public entities are growing in these spaces, I imagine that creates a risk because they're not tax entities. And so that could potentially create a challenge for future growth, because even though you have development, you're not adding to the pot that could potentially be leveraged for future development. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
To some extent. But I think in the case of every district that I can think of like that one in the country, where a public institution anchors economic growth, it's spinning off a variety of activities that are in fact taxable. So there's a priority and I think success in bringing in a grocery store there. You're going to see a range of tech transfer activities that are taxable, that some of which presumably will locate in that area because they'll want to be near the university. So yes, I mean, it's a problem for everybody who has large amounts of tax-exempt property, but there's no reason to hope and not to hope and expect that you'll also get taxable activity as well.
But I guess as steward of the City of Atlanta's finances, if there's a project before us as a council seeking to leverage tax funds to provide financing for a project, we shouldn't have to feel some kind of way about hurting the TAD or hurting that fund, because it's not going to imperil future growth from other private developers. It's just for this project, it might not in itself provide additional funds, but other projects will potentially come, and it's not something that we should be super.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, frankly, one of the challenges that tax increment financing has had all over the country, that California in particular struggled with, sure, Roz will agree with me, is this business of not being able to move money out of the district. So if you define the problem as being the district and the district boundaries and whether it's growing or not, you're making life difficult on yourself. But clearly, Georgia State's expansion is good for the city. It's good for all of the city, and it will, to some extent, generate taxable activity in the district.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, Council President.
Could you just go into a little more detail about the east side and the bonds being restricted and then not being restricted? And also, as you do that, can you clarify in the appendix The notation there is that it's defeased February 11th, 2019. Could you just talk a little bit more in detail about ESAT?
I'm going to defer to my colleagues in West Atlanta. I could start, but they'll do better.
Could I suggest we jump into Nino's piece where we're going to do the finances? That's the next, I'm sorry, sir, is that okay?
That's okay.
That is like the next section, so you're right on.
That's okay. So Councilmember Juan is being your ally up here. So I'm fine. I have one other thread I want to pull on, though, which is a different thread from Chair Dozier's thread, and that is there's been a lot of conversation in Fulton County about how various taxes are split between county and city, and in their discussions, they have said publicly that TADs are one of the reasons why Fulton doesn't have the necessary financial revenues that they need in order to do their services. I am curious if in a different vein, how are TADs impacting Fulton County? We've talked a lot about APS, but are they in fact impacting Fulton County? Do we see this as ultimately increasing Fulton County's tax digest as well?
I'm going to call up Roz, and I'm looking at our CFO, but I would just refer back to what Candace reported about how much we've our tax increase, 12-1, but I'll let the CFO.
Glad to see the team effort here.
Specifically to the impact on Fulton County, if you remember on a tax digest, APS digest is about half of the digest. We're about 25% of Fulton County and 25% of the city of Atlanta. So the impact to Fulton County's annual operating budget is the same impact that it is to the city of Atlanta's general fund budget. So from that's the high level perspective. But I do think that it's important to probably let Nino finish through his section of the presentation because he digs into the impact on each specific tax allocation.
But just at a high level, I want to make sure that this comparison is fair. If we're 12-1 from a city perspective, given that the impacts are about the same city to county,
right,
it's fair that same sort of impact should be felt by Fulton. Is that a fair proportion?
Yes, that is a fair portion, except Fulton probably less so than the city because they have a larger footprint than the city of Atlanta. So
sure.
They're collecting taxes not just in the city, but other cities as well.
But the impacts on the city, the positive impacts of the city are going to be felt by Fulton in the same, basically
Absolutely.
in the same sort of way.
Absolutely.
Maybe not proportional to their budget, but in the same sort of absolute way.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yep.
Councilman Juan.
My question is directly following that, and you kind of beat me to the punch on this one. So, then this, I think, is probably better for Dr. Klementich. Who's doing the calculus in terms of dollars of TAD funds that are being invested in the projects that y'all select versus the economic impact that the percentages could have should they go back to the original taxing entity? So for every dollar that we're investing, that's 50 cents. Well, that's not true. I mean, I'm talking about the increment right now. 50 cents would have gone back to the public schools, and you could argue that that investment in our public schools also has an economic development effect. And same thing with Fulton County, that the activities that they do are also lifting the tides. Who's doing that calculus, and who's advocating on behalf of that perspective to make sure that the projects we're deciding to invest in are really the best and highest use of those dollars?
So for every project that we invest in, we run the economic analysis. So we'll look at we use impact in plan that looks at direct, indirect, and induce on every single project. And then on the business development side, we also can run another analysis that looks at the direct tax implications. So we're running that analysis, and we're happy to provide them on every single project if you're interested.
Which I appreciate, but the alternative of those investments or giving the increment back, who's running that? Who's saying that?
That would be more of like what we would call as an opportunity cost in economics, the what if it hadn't happened. We rely on what actually happened. We don't run opportunity costs. I could try to maybe reach out to some economist friends to see if we could, but that really what it would be is, if we're investing here, what would it be? It would be an opportunity cost. I'd have to run that kind of analysis on.
So the hazard in that, you realize, is that we never get out of it. The projects that we have before us that you do the sophisticated analysis on will always have a great ROI, but we never consider if the funds were returned back to the other agencies. And if Fulton County had the money to invest in health initiatives or arts that also have an economic benefit, I mean, that...
It would just be hard to do, Councilmember, because if the money if the money wasn't used for this and was used for, I would have to make a whole bunch of assumptions. Did you invest in education? Did you invest in healthcare? Did you invest in streets, sidewalks? Each of those, having different economic impacts. So it would be hard for us. It's a hard analysis to do.
I don't disagree with that, but I do think it should be an important part of the dynamic and just philosophically that we have to remind ourselves again that the dollars we have are by virtue of the other taxing agencies, and there's nothing more addictive than opium. It's like a drug. I mean, if we have other people's money, it's easy to spend. But we have to remember that they have their missions as well, and that their investments sometimes are just as important as the ones that y'all are looking at.
And they're all important. A city needs it all, and that's a challenge, right? Do you invest in a park or a fireman or a fire station or a library? They're all important, so you want them all.
Sure.
And we need them all.
Sure. So I think that's why the assessment and the analysis that your consultants do all the time about whether they're substantively complete or not is critical, because we have to have some way that nudges us out of TADs when we should be out of them. And I just worry sometimes that we don't have that voice and that perspective or that push. And I think as policymakers on our side, that's part of our job too. It's just too tempting to keep them going. And that's where that but-for, again, I'm trying to close all these loops that I opened up earlier, but the but-for test becomes really critical on every decision we make with these TAD dollars, especially those that are in the partially complete, almost to substance, especially those. So,
The only thing I add, though, is that, at least in theory, and we could debate how much of the theory is real, the money wouldn't exist. I mean, there would be no public funds to spend but for these investments. So, obviously, these are good, intelligent people doing the best they can to administer a but-for test. Is it really 12 to 1? I don't know, but were you to back off for that some significant amount, it's nonetheless the case that there's a very large amount of money that wouldn't be accruing but for these investments, and therefore it wouldn't exist.
Don't disagree with that.
The school system wouldn't, because you have to have an actual funding vehicle.
I don't disagree with that. I feel that argument is more compelling when the TAD is formed and diminishes over time. Once you start getting towards partially complete, that but-for test starts going away. The qualifier, the ones that I think would meet that, start falling off, because you've already lifted the tide. The economic development is there. You've reaped the benefits of it. Private money is now starting to come in. The stadium TAD being a great example. You've done the work. The TAD has worked, and at some point, we got to be real about exiting out and have the discipline to exit out when it's appropriate, because otherwise we'll keep finding projects that are worthy. But we have to remember that at some point there is an inflection point, and we just have to have the discipline to recognize it. So thank you.
If it's okay, so we can get back to President Chipman's question, I will ask Nino to join us, and he'll go over the numbers for us.
Boy.
Again? So I'm going to go over the financial slides. Oh, sure.
If you could introduce yourself one more time.
All right, so I'm Nino Chiappetta. I am the CFO at Invest Atlanta. All right, so this slide shows a map of the 10 TADs along with the inception and estimated closure date. Two items of note are, the next two that are expected to close are Atlantic Station, which is estimated to close in 2024, and Princeton Lakes, which is expected to close in 2027. On the next slide, you'll see how the TADs have performed. So cumulative growth in assessed value of each TAD compared to its base year. The current assessed value of all the TADs is $7.54 billion, which is an increase of $6.13 billion over the base year. This is a cumulative average growth rate of 11% per year. The next slide, it shows taxable values of the TADs of $7.54 billion, which is 16.93% of the City of Atlanta total tax digest of $44.58 billion. So no new TADs can be created unless the assessed value of the TADs falls below 10%. Next slide. It shows how much tax increment has been collected in fiscal year 2022. So the total collection was $160 million, and by TAD, the top three are Beltline, East Side, and West Side TAD. The next slide shows the Beltline TAD, and it shows the three jurisdictions participating in the Beltline TAD being Atlanta Public Schools, Fulton County, and City of Atlanta. It shows the actual collections in the last 3 fiscal years along with the estimated collections for the next 3 fiscal years, the fund balance, and the committed TAD projects. The next slide shows the East Side TAD and has the same information that was in the Beltline. So one item to note is that the Atlanta Public School portion of the tax increment will be piloted back to APS effective in July of 2022 when the omnibus TAD agreement payments were made, and this is an estimated impact of over $14 million in fiscal year 2023. The next slide shows the West Side TAD, and there's no major items to report on the West Side TAD. Next slide is the Atlantic Station TAD. One item to note is that all the excess increment is being used to pay down the existing debt, which is expected to mature in 2024. There's also one City of Atlanta infrastructure project that will be funded from the tax increment. Next slide is the Perry Bolton TAD, and there's no major items to note in the Perry Bolton TAD. Next slide is the Princeton Lakes TAD. One item of note is that unlike the previous TADs, the Atlanta Public Schools do not participate in the Princeton Lakes TAD. Also, although the debt is scheduled to mature in 2027, we do plan on retiring it early. Next slide is the Camilton Road TAD. So this slide shows the Camilton Road TAD. And, again, one item to note is that the Atlanta Public Schools did not participate in this and the next 3 TADs effectively until July of 2022 when the omnibus TAD agreement payments were made. And so there's an estimated $807,000 in increment in fiscal year 2023 to be piloted from APS to the Camilton Road TAD. Next slide is the Stadium Neighborhood TAD. And so one item of note is that there's an estimated $533,000 in increment in fiscal year 2023 to be piloted from APS to the Stadium TAD. The next slide shows the Hollowell MLK TAD, and the item to note there is that there's an estimated $469,000 in increment in fiscal year 2023 to be piloted from APS to the Hollowell MLK TAD. The next slide is the Metropolitan Parkway TAD, and the item to note there is that there's an estimated $264,000 in increment in fiscal year 2023 to be piloted from APS to the Metropolitan Parkway TAD. And then the next slide is an appendix that shows, the outstanding debt for the different TADs: Princeton Lakes, Atlantic Station, Beltline, Perry Bolton, the West Side TAD, and the East Side TAD bonds, which have been defeased in 2019. So effectively, all the money to pay the bonds is sitting with a escrow agent, and that earns interest, and the bonds are paid over the years. So no more money will have to come out of increment to pay the East Side TAD bonds. So that concludes the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes. Oh,
Councilman Overstreet.
Yeah, just quickly. So how do you think that the Princeton Lakes TAD was so successful without the APS buy-in?
I think there was less. I'm not sure what I think the goals for the Princeton Lakes TAD and the amount of development was different for some of the other TADs. Mm-hmm. So they were able to achieve their goals much quicker because they had much less development to do.
So demand, probably just the need was so big that it was kind of on autopilot, because I'm finding that that's not the normal scenario at all.
Right, so yeah, that's definitely not the normal scenario. Dr. Clemente, do you want to say something?
No. I'll add too, I think some of it, to your point, is when it comes to development, it's private developers are going to look at household income, disposable income in terms of determining where their opportunities are for investment. I think there was a different type of investment appetite in that TAD compared to some of our other corridors. Well, we haven't seen that amount of development or that kind of interest yet in those corridor TADs.
Okay, and as far as the Campbellton Road TAD converting to just a regular TAD, do you have a prognosis for that? Like, how do you think that's going to look?
I think there's a lot of excitement on the Campbellton Road and Metropolitan. There's a lot of investment. There's investment, we talked about it before, on some city investment. We're seeing, like on Metropolitan, you're seeing like the Goodwill, I think is also good. There's a new police station. That's causing the interest, and the amount of traffic, vehicular traffic coming up and down these corridors heads into the city is at least from our information with some of our retailers that we're trying to attract, they're looking at that data and that information. So I think it's a combination that it's coming. We see the interest.
Okay.
It's going to take a little longer in those parts of town.
You mean it's taking a little?
It's taking.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman Lewis. And similar to the Princeton Lake and with it partnering Camp Creek Marketplace, could it be the partnership with the other city as well that helped out?
Definitely. I think the other city, and then right close by, is the average person doesn't know, I'm in the city of Atlanta, or I'm in a different city. And so when retailers are looking, they pull out an area, either a census tract or a community level, and they pull disposable income, household average, the value of a home. And so with Camp Creek so close, that lifts up the numbers for retailers and their interest.
And I'm only thinking that because a lot of my district borders are the same city and borders College Park and East Point and Hapeville. And was that like a working relationship with Invest Atlanta and the other city, or how would that go? Because you also mentioned that we didn't have to do some of that stuff there because of the other city wanting to build up Camp Creek Marketplace?
Well, I definitely have relationships with some of the other cities, but I would just say some of the different strategies, different interests, but we try to coordinate when we can. I won't say we talk every day, but definitely if we can work together, we're going to work together. I do that often with my colleagues.
Yeah, because I'm thinking the Jonesboro Road corridor at the exit of 285 looks exactly like the Camp Creek. And my dream is that Jonesboro Road turns into our Camp Creek, the bottom of the city. And also on the other side of my district, if you look at what Hapeville and East Point is doing with the Walmart and with the other things they've put up, but you know the moment you walk into Atlanta because there's nothing there. So I'm wondering how do we get them to partner up with us on those areas as well? And also, can I recruit businesses to become a part of the TAD? Like I have Georgia State. I was very impressed by the Georgia State announcement, but we also have Atlanta Metropolitan College and Atlanta Area Tech, which are in my area, and I want to know if they're being given the same kind of opportunities that Georgia State's been given.
Yeah, so there is no limit. I think the question is, retailers are going to look for different retailers look for different things. I know some are very specific on what side of the street they're on because they're trying to get traffic either in or out. Some are going to look at education levels. Some are going to look at disposable income. So there's nothing prohibiting us trying to get the businesses. We want them in the TAD to come. The question will be is, with what they're looking for and the space that's available, can they find something in the TAD that works with all of their requirements? That is for us what we find as the challenge is how do you find that alignment between what is available and what they're looking for, and can we make that happen for them in the TAD? We'd love for them to come. We're actively recruiting, trying to get retailers to come into some of our TADs.
Councilmember Juan, Council President Shipman.
We get to Council President Shipman's question. I just want to make sure, sir. Because I kept saying to wait, and I just wanted to make sure I got to.
I actually want to level set a couple of things just for the record.
Okay.
if you go back to page 33 for a minute, the only way to create a new TAD is to get below the 10% jurisdiction level, correct? Right. And if you look at this chart closely, the only way to get under 10% would either be the closing of the Beltline TAD, or if the Beltline TAD remains in place, you'd have to close both east side and west side because there's just no other way to get below the 10% threshold, correct? Okay.
Correct.
So really, we get asked a lot on council, well, can we create another TAD? And the answer is you either have to close the Beltline and or you have to close both east and west before you could get below 10%. Just that's statute. Second, do you have any notion of additional bonds being issued against any of these TADs in the future? Is that a potential part of the strategy going forward, or do you not see that as a part of the strategy going forward?
I didn't see that as part of the strategy going forward.
And could you just talk for a minute why not? Obviously, we've used bonding in the past. Why not at this point going forward?
I think basically we feel like the increment that's being generated is enough to accomplish the goals that we have.
So in essence, we don't need the bonds because the increment in each of these various areas is enough?
I'm a little on my.
I'm causing problems today.
So I
hope I'm not getting charged on a per hour basis for this.
You definitely are. You're going to get the bill this afternoon. So just keeping things in perspective, you're looking at things on a snapshot basis on the assessments as of today, which are the property tax digest is a high digest today. It's generating sufficient income to operationally benefit the TADs. If we have economic impacts like 2007, 2008 crash that caused the assessments and essentially the benefit of the TAD from keeping an increment to be able to operationalize those dollars, that doesn't exist. So in times when there's economic strife and economic impacts, bonding becomes a better tool because you can get the money now, knowing that the rebound will eventually happen, and you can start to spread out the cash flow over a longer period of time. So remember those TADs that were created, probably the worst time that you could create a TAD in 2006, 2007, followed right by a deep dive in economic collapse, essentially. You would need it to have bonded your way to make sure that you can invest in the projects that are needed and the benefits of that community. So as it stands today, that is not a current plan of the city or Invest Atlanta. I can speak to them on their behalf, but I'm sure that they will assess continuously on an annual basis to see if it's feasible at the time. But if things are, in the condition that they're at right now, and the economic condition stays the same, or if the dip is slight and somewhat we anticipate to be not as impactful, we could probably see our way through it. But it becomes an analysis that will need to be assessed on every 2 to 3 year basis.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the East Side TAD. So in the appendix on page 48, the bond information defeased February 11, 2019. Could you just give everybody a sense of the initial bonds and why they couldn't be spent, and then the defeasement? Just walk us through a little bit of this on the East Side, if you would.
Let me see if I can be helpful. So every time bonds are issued, as you know from the variety of water, sewer, airport, geo bonds that you issue, there are different provisions that get negotiated in the indenture in those bond documents. When the East Side TAD, when you got ready to issue the first series of East Side TAD bonds, the indenture did not allow for accumulated increment to be spent on additional projects. So what you had was 8 to 10 large projects that were completed and they were highly successful, as you can see from how the value has gone up. And however, there was no way to unlock that accumulated increment. At the time, the city and APS didn't have the best relationship with respect to TADs, and I would say that at that time we were negotiating the Beltline pilot payments, because as CFO Bala said, you end up with a crash, an economic crash. The pilot payments that were originally scheduled to be made were going to end up being more than the increment. So there was sort of an impasse there. And as part of negotiating revised Beltline pilot payments, we were also able to negotiate unlocking the East Side TAD increment to be used for qualifying projects within the TAD. So that meant that there was quite a bit of time during which no projects other than the original ones that were listed in the bond documents could be done in the East Side TAD. And so that's why there's a significant balance that built up as soon as we were able to negotiate it, just like the TAD agreement that involved the Gulch parcels, the length of the West Side TAD, and the 4 corridor TADs. That agreement solved the East Side TAD issue. So when the bonds were defeased, there was an agreement, and so that means the bonds were not callable. They're not due yet, but you're allowed under IRS regs to put the money basically with the trustee in a lockbox. And so they actually have not been completely paid off, but the money's there to pay them off. And then APS is getting their 50% rebated back to them.
Okay, so in essence, the bonds basically have the money to pay them off, setting aside. The impact of APS, the agreement with APS means that about $14 million impact on a per year basis now going forward, right?
Yes.
So it's roughly $13-ish million per year in an increment, right?
Yes.
For the foreseeable future. So the obvious question is, why isn't this on a path to closure? Because it just looks like it should be by the other ways that we've talked about, Princeton Lakes and the others. So what's the thinking around the East Side TAD?
So in this context is that there are important, more community-based rather than corporate headquarter construction-based. They're community-based and, projects that to create affordable housing that are left. And for that reason, it might be, what's the category called? Substantially? Partially complete, but is not totally complete.
And I would say, I know that we have AJ here with Central Atlanta Partners who can also give more insight into the East Side TAD, but we really think that there is a need to focus on some parts of the TAD and are very interested in projects. We have been working very diligently with them. We knew, we looked at the East Side TAD in particular and just tried to determine where were the projects going that we were funding, why could we get more, and what we realized, and to Roz's point, is that there were a lot of nonprofits, churches, big churches that owned a lot of land in the East Side, and so the reason they weren't able to come to the table was because they, I love to say, are they have a lot of capital in terms of they're asset rich, but maybe cash flow tight, and so don't have the funds to do some of the work that's needed to come to the East Side TAD. These are taxpayer dollars, so we require you to have your architectural renderings, your engineering, your EIRs. They didn't have either and or expertise and or money, and how do we help unlock that? And so working together with our partners, literally we walked up and down the corridor, and talking and trying to understand what the needs were. As a result, we created this pre-development loan fund, the pre-development loan, as a result of pre-development fund as a result of the East Side TAD, and this is now work. So again, ebbing and flowing, understanding the challenges, that provided many of the East Side TAD projects to go get the engineering, the EIRs, the legal, construction, architectural renderings to then apply to the East Side TAD. And we've seen a couple of them now come back. And so, again, it's us understanding what the needs are, who our client was, who needed this support to be able to unlock some of these tools. And I know under public comment, AJ can talk a little bit more about what he's done there, or what we've done together.
Just, AJ, if you do want to come up and speak to that now, you can come up now. I know you're going to speak to public comment, but if you want to address any part of that, you're more than welcome to.
Particularly to the East Side TAD, I'm going to let my colleague Elena, who has the data on the program and can describe that particular program.
Thanks, AJ. Good afternoon, everybody. Elena Green with Central Atlanta Progress. I have the pleasure of leading our economic development work for the organization. I think Eloisa said it best. Invest Atlanta has been nothing short of creative and collaborative in this way. 2 or 3 years ago, we applied for a $1 million East Side TAD grant to be matched at a similar level by our board of directors to really stand up this pre-development and technical assistance grant. So that's finding, as Eloisa said, the faith-based institutions in Sweet Auburn, the nonprofit owners that really desire to stay in the neighborhood but frankly need a little bit of runway and support when it comes to pre-development. A lot of times we talk about this tool as bringing developers to the table, and we want to make sure our legacy landowners are prepared for those conversations, can stay in the deal in really competitive ways so that they then bear the benefits of any deal or transaction that happens on their land. And so we've really focused those dollars in providing support for architectural services, feasibility analysis, again, to better prepare those projects for an ultimate East Side TAD application for the sticks and bricks. And so that's just been a really innovative private-public partnership, again, matched with some dollars from our board and providing not only the capital to provide those more technical services, but the person on the other end of the phone that's going to answer those questions, providing that technical expertise to a group that doesn't wake up every day with a real estate development hat on. So through that program, we've been able to touch 20 different sites in Sweet Auburn. And out of those 20, we've seen about $7.3 million from the East Side TAD be ultimately awarded to those projects because they were more ready, because they were able to really present the case to the Invest Atlanta board. So really proud of that project, and work certainly continues in that capacity as well.
Any additional comment or questions from?
Well, I mean, this is a unique one, right? And all cards on the table. I mean, I think a lot of the public knows that I live in the East Side TAD, so this is, I'm very familiar and with this. Because APS is being refunded, in essence, this is just City of Atlanta and Fulton, right? We're in essence asking the taxes that are coming out of that jurisdiction. So this is almost like this is looking more and more like a CID, which is fine, which is both good and bad. But I think fundamentally that, the question has to be back to Councilmember Wan's question, which is, is the use of the reinvestment here higher than it would be across the entire city and the entire county, because we're focusing a lot of increment, even without APS, $13 million a year, $14 million a year in one geography. And I think that's worth continuing to be pushed on pretty hard, because there are certainly parts of this TAD that are receiving an enormous amount of commercial investment, and that the market is falling all over itself to try to invest in. And granted, there are parts of this TAD in which that is not happening at all, but this is not Campbellton. Let's just be honest, right? This is not even Princeton Lakes. I mean, this is a very unique, sort of extremely active and extremely desolate in one geography. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about how we think about the dollars and where they go. To Councilmember Wan's point, I think the but-for test on projects in this kind of situation is exactly the kind of framework that should be used very specifically. And that's less about the TAD itself, but about the unique nature of this particular TAD.
Councilman Juan.
Yeah, I wrote but for all over the east side TAD. Yeah, quit looking on my paper. So yeah, I mean, I want to echo that. So, just so that I understand the math correctly and the way this slide is presented, as of July 31st, there's almost $68 million that is available for redevelopment use. Is that correct? Provided it meets the TAD investment criteria. It's non-committed. Then each year going forward, we're going to get another $13 million in increment because you take out the $14 million pilot back to APS. And we're projecting that this, per that other slide, that we're going to go out to 2030 with this. So there's another 7 years roughly. So that's another $90 million that's going to go in there. $170 million. It's a lot of money. All right. So what's the plan? What have y'all articulated a redevelopment strategy and plan that satisfies the but for and isn't just trying to build up a bucket of money that we can dip into when we need it for fun things? I mean, and the other comment I'll make, and then I'll let you answer, is that if you do the math, now it's just City of Atlanta and Fulton. I mean, $7 million, $6.5 million roughly for each entity. I think what you talked about, the investments that you're making in the specific areas, you mentioned there was $7 million that was going back, is another way of saying, let's give all the increment back and then we can earmark the city's piece for redevelopment in that area. That might be another, again, thinking about who's doing the calculus on the other side of what that money could be doing if it weren't just trapped in the TAD.
I'll tell you, I think some of this discussion, we're going to look to both the administration and city council for guidance because there are a lot of choices that have to be made and I recognize there's a lot of decisions and a lot of great investments that need to be done. And so we'll follow the lead of you because we've been asked to be your implementers of the TAD. I'll say from an Invest Atlanta economic development lens, so I respect that I'm only bringing in one lens, is we're going to look to how do we create the most competitive city? How do we create a city that's equitable? How do we address these issues? And we believe that with the strength of the TAD, we can come in and do that. We need funding. This has been an area that has lacked investment for many years, albeit I get there are some parts that are getting it, but there are still some that are not. And so if we want to create that equitable city, and I know there's big landowners in this part of town that are nonprofits that are going to need our support to be successful and to keep them legacy, then from the eyes and perspective of Invest Atlanta, I say we need to ensure that the Eastside TAD is in existence so we can address those projects and build the equitable city we all want to be a part of.
I think just for me, this will be an annual justification because, again, you've got $68 million already at your disposal. That's a significant bucket of resources to do all the great things that I know y'all can do with it. And then $14 million a year for the next projected 7 or 8 years. I mean, it's just going to have to be very compelling. I would imagine, going back to my initial question, I would imagine that East Side, in that continuum of, it's probably leaning closer to substantially complete, much like Perry Bolton probably is as well.
I just, it's tough. There were a lot of years we could not use the funds. And so we're kind of paying catch up. And so I would hate that the East Side now is having, again, I respect it's from my perspective and my lens that we now are getting these projects in line. We're able to spend it. And so that's what we're doing. But I still want to be very diligent. It's taxpayer dollars. I want good projects. I want them to be successful. So I don't want to rush either to get it out. I want to make sure we're getting really good projects.
I'm not necessarily advocating that we sunset this one, but I do think this is one of the ones that we as policymakers should keep a very close eye on because given the amount of money as well as what's going to continue to get put in that bucket, I think we owe it to the taxpayers and to Fulton County, quite frankly, to be not just good, but excellent stewards of the fund. I said this earlier, and I know that Councilmember Dozier and I have joked about it. At the beginning, TADs are created because we have great projects looking for money. I don't want us to be in a situation where we've got a lot of money just looking for good projects. That's not what TADs were meant to do. And I worry sometimes when I see eye-popping numbers like this that
I will tell you that we have a very robust pipeline because of the great work we've done, and so I suspect that that number will be much different when we're up here 2 years from now.
Not sure how I feel about that. I'm not asking you to go spend it down just so the number's not as eye-popping, but... But
what I'm saying is that we've been working on these projects, but you got to get them ready. That pre-development loan, it just takes time. So now that we've been spending the time getting projects ready, they're starting to come to us now, which is good.
But for. Thanks.
Bringing a lot of great affordable housing.
Hey, Councilman Juan. We'll cose with Council President Shipman.
Thanks. Just one other different kind of question. On page 31, there's an estimated closure. And I note here that the West Side TAD, its estimated closure is 2038, Perry Bolton 2041. Given the specifics of Campbellton, Hollowell, and Metropolitan Parkway, why wouldn't we go ahead and extend those out? Why wouldn't we go ahead and say to ourselves and the market and everybody, you know what, these are areas that we know are going to continue to need investment. This is kind of to Councilmember Juan's point, this is kind of the classic where TADs can have a huge impact up front, trying to drive development. Why wouldn't we as a body say, hey, let's put 2041 out so that everybody understands it's going to still be there?
I would think that I would look to both your leadership, APS, and Fulton County. If everybody agreed, we'd be happy and think it makes a lot of sense strategically, especially when we're trying to attract more retail, more active economic activity. But I'd look to the administration and to the council and our Fulton County and APS.
Yeah, so I would just make the comment, following up on that conversation. To me, those three specifically are ones for consideration of an extension now, so that we're sending the signal of trying to drive long-term capital, trying to lower the risk, frankly, in those areas, trying to create some demand in areas that don't have as much as we'd like to see. So I would just note that as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you to the Invest Atlanta team for your presentation. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for tackling all the hard questions. And it was really great to see the team effort before us this afternoon, this afternoon now. We're literally afternoon now. So the next portion of the agenda, we do want to take some time for public comment. I think we have I know we have a few people signed up for public comment. AJ and Elena, I think y'all are first in the chute if y'all want to go ahead. And usually when we do our committee meetings and full council meetings, we have a nice fancy timer on the screen, but today we're going to be a little bit less fancy. But you'll have 3 minutes, AJ.
Okay. AJ Robinson, I'm the president of Central Atlanta Progress in Atlanta Downtown Improvement District. I feel like I could have my own public hearing with you guys on the history of TAD, since I think I'm the only one here that was around the beginning of the West Side TAD, East Side TAD 20 years ago. You've heard a lot back and forth. Y'all had some great questions. First, let me just say that this is not an exact science. I'm here representing pretty much the folks on the other side who have to first bring 80 to 90% of the capital to a project, particularly in the East Side and West Side, looking for that gap financing that Invest Atlanta has to make a judgment about. We can have all the policies and all the wish lists that we want, but unless the market is interested in an area, in a project, there is no use of the TAD. The greatest example of that probably was Atlantic Station, where you had one big project TAD and it worked. Princeton Lakes worked. The Beltline's working. I would argue that the rest of us are still a work in progress. Just since there's been a lot of conversation about the East Side TAD, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. Number one, we have a road that runs through the East Side TAD. It carries 350,000 cars a day. It's a tremendous barrier to development in the King Historic District on either side. We've had great success on Councilman Shipman's side because the Beltline has crept, the Beltline TAD has crept towards boulevards, but we have a huge challenge, the barrier of the highway, on both sides. The second thing, and I would just caution you, we're in an incredibly difficult market going forward in downtown, and perhaps all across the city. The definition of an office is changing. We're going to have, sadly, a lot of empty buildings everywhere, but particularly in our downtown community on the east side, where the only real solution may be conversion to housing. And we're in an inflationary environment, we're in a post-COVID environment, and that $65 million may look like a lot of money, but if we were able to bring a project to Invest Atlanta that had 300 or 400 units of affordable housing, that would probably eat up 2/3 of that money, and they would take that project if we could deliver it. So we're in a very, very difficult market. People look at buildings downtown and think, oh, that's very healthy. I can tell you a lot of them are empty, and a lot of them will be empty, and you're going to be hearing about financial stress in a lot of office buildings. And a lot of these, by the way, are not even in the East Side TAD, but they abut the East Side TAD and have an effect on our East Side TAD property holdings. So I appreciate the ideas about closing, but I agree we should look at this every year. We have lots of projects that I think we could. Right now, we're only doing things about affordability. There is no other use for our TAD dollars right now except infrastructure, which would lead to affordability. We need to invest in lots of things in the east side and the west side, by the way, which we are doing, that would lead to affordability. So we appreciate the spotlight. I think we would be in the camp that our work is not yet done, and would enjoy the partnership with the city and particularly with Invest Atlanta to continue that work.
AJ. Elena.
Thank you all. Elena Green with Central Atlanta Progress. I had a chance to share most of my comments earlier, but I just wanted to also stress this point around TADs as a tool to finance that affordable housing goal that we and I know all of you share. And just a point of clarification, within a TAD, if there is a project for affordable housing, some of the other city tools that we have are not eligible to be used in the TAD, so we really are not necessarily double dipping. We're using the TAD as that mechanism to deliver that affordability. This is my math, not official Invest Atlanta numbers, but since 2005 in the East Side TAD, we estimate about 2,600 units of housing have been financed thanks to that tool, with about 1,000 of those units as affordable. So that's a 40% ratio in total, which is more than I think we've been able to see without a TAD, absolutely. We talk about pipeline. We've got another about 1,000 housing units that are in that pipeline, another 400 of those being affordable within the Sweet Auburn neighborhood alone. So I think there's a bit of a misnomer with a name like the East Side TAD. What we're really talking about, and this is thanks largely in part to legislation in 2019 that really focused the funding priorities of the East Side TAD to the Sweet Auburn neighborhood and the Memorial Drive corridor. So we're talking about neighborhoods truly impacted by the interstate and decades-long disinvestment. So with that, and since that legislation really went into place, most of the funding from East Side TAD, if not all, has really been focused on those two neighborhoods. So just want to kind of just ground truth a little bit of the geography conversation to what we're talking about in particular, and happy to be a resource in terms of more detail on some of those projects going forward. And thank you all for your work on this.
Thank you. Up next, Ted Bradford. Ted does not appear to be here. All right. Nia, come to the podium.
Hi, my name is Naya, actually. I'm with People for the People. I'm sure y'all are tired of hearing us. I'm tired of hearing us too. $235 million to the police, $1.3 to community development. I I would like to see that number get to like 10, 15 million baseline for community development, and I personally would like to see it directly coming from the police. I really don't have much else to say to y'all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya. MJ.
Okay, hello. I am also with People for the People. I actually had some questions because of I went to the last finance meeting and the community advancement meetings. So one thing that was mentioned at that meeting was the increase of the police presence at the parks. And I had questions about that and what was going on with that. And then also, we had an issue with them recently, and they also didn't know which ordinances they were upholding when they came up to us. And so I'm curious on how we're going to be handling that in the future, on whether or not they would be knowing the ordinances. And regarding these, the rules and regulations for different parks, especially along the Beltline and in Old Fourth Ward Park, they don't list, they're not like up to date, if that makes sense, if the ordinance is in place regarding amplified voices. Those are not listed, and I'm not sure if those are upholding the ordinances that were set from the city, like here, or if it's the rules of the park, but I believe it is ordinances from here. And those are not posted publicly, so if anybody can't go online and find them, and it's difficult to find and understand ordinances already, so having those listed in plain text would also be helpful. I feel like a lot of the ordinances and the rules that are in the park along the Beltline hinder the creativity of the musicians and the people and the protesters along the Beltline, which is not something that I think that we want in return, in like terms of like community advancement, because if we have a larger police presence and less of a public presence because of people being like getting into trouble because of different rules and regulations that are set in the park that hinder that creativity, we're going to see less community in our like parks and along the Beltline. Okay, and then I had some other questions. 1 second. Let me go here. Okay. Okay, so another thing is that while we were there, obviously we learned a lot of what like happens when those like ordinances are violated. However, I feel like there should have been more warning. Because we were just approached and told that, like, hey, you're violating this, you're in trouble now. There was no warning. I don't think that an increase of police presence is going to help that at all. So if we can hopefully get those questions answered about what we're going to do about those.
Thank you for your comments. I will just, on that last, onto your portion, I'll give you my card because I want you to share that with me, and I can put you in the right, because it's not a parks focus work session, so we don't have anyone from the Parks Department here or anyone from APD here, but want to make sure that at least on the parks piece, you can get those questions answered so that you can get more clarification. And then I want to make sure I can connect you with the Atlanta Civil Review Board. So if you have any challenges with APD, you can. There's a process for redress that I want to make sure you know and can navigate so that you can get that address as well. But I'll stay back after we close out to make sure you get that information. Thank you. All right. With that being said, I just want to say thank you all so much once again for joining us this morning/afternoon. It's morning somewhere, it's afternoon somewhere. So, but just thank you so much once again. Thank you to my colleagues for joining us today and for your wonderful questions. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm going to go ahead and adjourn this work session. Thank you so much.